Today's daf is daf Nun Zion, and we continue with the Treifa halacha regarding birds. And I think there are two main focal points of today's discussion. One is called the Tzomet Hagidin, and the other is called the thigh bone. So we'll as we go along, we'll try to figure out what these are based on the charts here. Nishtabu ragleha. So we're talking about the legs of the bird that were broken, and we have to figure out exactly where on the legs, whether it's the upper part of the leg, the lower part of the leg, which would be vital for the bird. And if it's broken, it could actually cause the animal to be a treifa, the bird to be a treifa. And the Gemara tells us the following situation because the Mishnah seems here to list these kind of injuries that allow permission to eat the bird, and it's not a treifa. Hahu sana de inkure. So we have a tsana. A tsana is like a basket, and inside the basket were birds. We don't know how many, but a bunch. And they had fractured legs. The asya, and they were brought Lakami de Rava as a shaila for Rava. Rava would have to determine whether or not the broken legs would make it into a treifa. Badke Rava, but Somas Hagidin. So Rava apparently was of the opinion that the main issue with regard to the area of the legs of a bird as to whether or not it makes it treifa is the tzomas hagidin. And here we have a, a diagram. It's all the way on the bottom of the chicken's body, like right before the small legs of a chicken. And it's made up of 16 sinews that converge. The word tzomet means a junction, even in modern Hebrew today. So if one of those sinews out of the 16 is severed, then the bird is considered treifa. So Rava therefore checked out the tzomes hagid, and he came to the conclusion that all the sinews were intact, and therefore achshere, he was machshir the bird. Now at this point, the Gemara goes back to a discussion that we had on Daf Nun Dalid about the case where the thigh bone was dislocated from its socket in the pelvic bone. Now, as a result of this dislocation, the connecting sinews disintegrated. The animal is treifa. Omar Rabbi Yehuda Marav. So all that is with regard to a behema. In the case of a behema, shmutas yad behema kshera. So we're not talking about the thigh bone dislocated from its socket, but rather a dislocation of the foreleg of the animal. Now, a Latin word for the foreleg here, or the first bone of the foreleg, is called the humerus. It's not very funny, but that's what it is. The thigh bone is in the hind leg, whereas The yad, which is the humerus, is in the foreleg. Ushmutas yorech bibehema treifa. Not sure if this should be part of the text of the Gemara. In my Gemara, it's in parentheses, but we'll translate it. And we're talking about the dislocation of the thigh bone, which we said back on Mem Dalid makes the animal into a treifa. But what's the parallel in the case of a bird? And that's called shmutas yorech. As I told you at the outset, these are the main topics of today's daf. We had the tzomes hagidin, and now we have shmutas yorech, which in the case of an animal, when the thigh bone becomes dislocated, it's treifa. So too, parallel, in the case of a dislocation of the thigh bone of a bird, it's treifa. I'm going to see that this is going to be a major controversy. So we're getting only one opinion. Now, what happens if the wing of the bird is dislocated? That's called shmutas gaf, biof, treifa. Now, why? You and I would say that the bird could continue living even if it has trouble with its wing, which is dislocated. But the answer is chayshinon. This is a suffix treifa, shemenikva hareya. In other words, the gaf, the wing, is right above the lung. Now, if you take a look at this diagram, you'll see that the lungs are encased in the rib cage. But nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda, in the name of Rav, is saying that once the wing is dislocated, it may, in effect, have the outcome of puncturing the lung. And therefore, it would seem that according to Rav, Shmutas Gaf Biof Treifa means it's an automatic treifa, which is a bit strange because the Gemara says it's only chayshinon. But Shmuel Omar, and we'll see that Rav Yochanan also agrees, that tibodek, you should not automatically render the oaf as treifa because of the wing's dislocation, but rather we should undergo an examination and see what is the situation of the reya. Was the reya in fact punctured or was it not? And we're going to insert a tube into the trachea. We're going to inflate the lung and see if air escapes, as I state in Rashi. Rabbi Yochanan tibodek. Chizki Omar ein re'eh liof. The most strange Gemara that we're about to learn. Chizki, who's the Gadol Adar, says that a bird doesn't have lungs. I'm not sure exactly how the bird lives without lungs. Rabbi Yochanan Omer Yeshlo. What are you talking about? I'll show you the lungs. Yeshna ke'ola shel vered bein agapayim. He describes the lung in the bird as a rose petal, which is situated between the wings of the bird. So again, it's hard to see it in this picture because you're only getting, one surface. So you're not seeing the other. You understand it's two-dimensional. You need something three-dimensional. But anyway, the lungs are located between the two wings of the bird. So the Gemara says, "My, what did Chizkiah mean when he said Ein Re'elio? Ilem de Leslie Klal? Is it possible that he meant that a bird doesn't have lungs? I mean, open up a bird and you'll see the lungs. Ella de lo mitrif be. But rather, Chizkiah is of the opinion that a punctured lung in the case of a bird does not render the bird treif. Gemara rejects that as well. Vatani Levi was a first generation that brought many of the brises, and he says treifel shemanu chacham b'behema kenegdim b'of, that any treifa that appears in an animal ipso facto has its counterpart in the oath, and therefore to the same extent that a punctured lung makes an animal into treifa, it will make a bird into treifa. Not only that, yeser aleim oath. There's a case of a treifa that exists in the bird and not in the animal, and that's nishbara etzem. If the skull was broken. Now, in the case of an animal, if the skull is broken, then we have to check out and see, as we discussed at great length, about the membrane that surrounds the brain. So the skull being broken does not ipso facto make an animal into treifa, but in the case of an oaf, ipso facto, without any conditions, if the skull is broken, the bird is a treifa. But in any event, getting back to the beginning of the brisa says that a punctured lung, which renders an animal treifa, has its counterpart in a bird, and it makes it treifa. Ella, so now let's try to reinterpret Chizkiah again. Ein lo li nofel v'lo lechamer. Now, lechamer means that it fell into a fire. Li nofel means that it fell from a roof, from a high point. Now, until now, we said, based on the previous daf, that if a bird falls from a height or into a fire, you have to examine its internal kishkis in order to make it kosher. And we're saying that that applies, according to Chizkiah at least, only with regard to a fall from a roof or falling into a fire. And we're going to do an internal examination of the kishkis, of the intestines, but not of the lungs. My timer. Why don't we check out the lungs? Rav Chana, Hoil Verov Tzalosel Meginos Oleh. As we said before, the lungs are surrounded by the rib cage, and the rib cage will protect the lungs. Gemara is still not happy. For Hamid Omar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan, when he responded to Chizkiah, what did he say? He says, Yeshlo, a bird has lungs. The Yeshna ke'ola shel vered bein hakapayim b'chal Chizkiah savar lesle. So therefore, from the fact that Rabbi Yochanan said to Chizkiah, a bird has lungs, and this is what it looks like, then obviously he was accusing Chizkiah of denying the possibility that a bird has lungs. Ella, and therefore the final conclusion is Amri b'marava. They said in there it's so Mishmeid Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina that midvarav shel berivi. Berivi means the gadol adar. That's a reference to Chizkiah. Nikar, we understand she'eno baki b'tarnagolan. Like, you know what? He never ate a chicken in his life, or he never saw a chicken. And it would seem that the final maskana of the Gemara is that Chizkiah thought that there was no lungs in a bird. Tosfos here, on the other hand, says that what the Gemara means to suggest in interpreting Chizkiah is that a bird's lung is not vulnerable to a fall or to scorching in a fire. And the reason for that is because the ribs protect the lungs of a bird. And the poskim say that maybe Chizkiah had a kind of Masorah that birds are not vulnerable to the treifa defects that apply to a lung. And Chizkiah thought that that when he heard that Masorah, he thought there were no lungs. Anyway, Rav Huna, Rav. Now we start the main sugya for today, and that's called Shmutas Yerech Ba'of, the dislocation of the thigh bone in the case of a bird. According to Rav, the way it's being quoted here by Rav Huna was in Bavel, kosher. Amalei Rabba bar Rav Huna Rav Huna, v'Rabbanan di asumi pumbedisa amru. When the Rabbanan came from Pumbedisa, they said Rav Yehuda Mishmei de Rav. They had a different tradition attributed to Rav from Rav Yehuda. That Shmutas Yerech Ba'of Treifa. So again, we're going to go back and forth about whether Shmutas Ha'of, the dislocation of the thigh bone, does it make the bird treifa or not? Amalei Bri, my son, right? Rav Huna talks to his son Rabbah, and he says to him, you know what? Nara v'nara upashti. This is an idiomatic phrase that's used very often in the Talmud, that every river has its own direction, its own current, and every area has its own tradition or transmission of the Torah. So we're left like sort of holding the bag as far as Rav Shita with regard to the dislocation of a thigh bone. We don't know if it is treif, it's not, different traditions in Rav. Also, Rabbi Abash Keil, Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, the Kabodik with Tzomas Hagidin. Now, the Gemara is suggesting a Kal V'chomer at this point, and that is the following. That if the thigh bone of a bird is dislocated, and the halach is kshera according to that opinion, then how much more so in the case of tzomas hagidin? Because the thigh bone is higher up in the bird. The tzomas hagidin, we say, is right down there with the feet, the little fisalach. So therefore, the Gemara asks, why are you worried about any sort of puncture or severance of the tzomas hagidin, of the sinews of the bird? Rav Huna Amar Rav, shmutas yarech biof kshera, dislocation of the thigh bone, it's kosher. Now, if it's dislocated, then it's non-functional and it's as if it doesn't exist, which would mean that a thigh bone, which is higher up in the bird, if it was amputated, the bird is still kosher. If you hold, according to that tradition of Rav, that shmutas yerech biof tahora, or kshera, I should say. And how much more so with the kal v'chomer, if the sinews, which are all the way on the bottom, near the ankle, are severed, certainly the bird should remain kosher. Amalei, so Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba says back to Rabbi Abba, I know a Mishnah. This is a Mishnah much later on in the Perek. And we're going to look at the way Rav interpreted that Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Behema shenechteku raglea min hakuva lamata kshera. If the animal's legs, let's say in the back, the hind legs, were severed below the ankle, like below the joint, is kshera. But min hakuva lamala, if it was severed above the joint, then it's treif. Now, again, we're talking about a behema, but Rav is going to say that Mishnah refers not only to behema, but also to oaf. V'chein, nital tzomas hagidin. So too, another way that the animal becomes treifa even if it wasn't severed above the joint, but nevertheless, nital tzomas agidin, if the sinews were cut, it's treifa. V'yomar Allah v'chein ba'of. So we see that on the one hand, Rav might hold that shmutas yerech ba'of is kshera, but nevertheless, in tzomas agidin, if there's a severance of the sinews, or maybe even only one sinew, and it's almost like in a bird, it's treif. So now the only way the Gemara is going to be able to reconcile this is by saying that for some strange reason the Tzomas Hagidin is more sensitive and more vital than even the Yerech, which is much higher up. And therefore, Yehochi Kash the Rav of the Rav, and therefore Ishtik, so Rabbi Yirmiyah didn't know. Amalei, so Rabbi Abba says, I know the difference. Shani Lun ben Shmuta lechattucha. Right? There's a difference between dislocation and severance. So what does that mean? We said that if there's dislocation, there's decay of the ligaments, and it's like amputation, which is called, in the language of Rabbi Abba, chatucha. In the case of severance of the Tzomas Hagidin, if the joint becomes dislocated, even if its dislocation is so severe that it's considered like amputation, the animal can still survive. But if the sinews are severed, then even if that occurs as low down in the bird as the Tzomas Hagidin, the animal is treif. This is an injury that's fatal. So again, the anatomy is hard to understand here because we're saying that a dislocation, even though it's considered like an amputation, and yet it's going to survive. But if you sever the Tzomas Hagidin, which is far, far, far below the thigh bone, nevertheless the animal is treif. Amalei, so Rabbi Yirmiyah says to him, "V'at mefarsh shmaited." Rabbi, you think you're explaining? You discovered America. Beferish Amarav, Rav himself said it explicitly that shmuta kshera chatucha psula. That dislocation, even though it's considered like amputation, the animal could still survive, even though it's high up on the animal in the thigh bone. But chatucha, if you sever anywhere in the tzomas hagidin, in the junction of the sinews, then it's treif, v'altisma, and you should never be surprised at these curveballs that we throw at you in treifus. Why? Chodcha mikan umesa, chodcha mikan v'chaisa. If you sever it here, it dies, and if you sever it there, it will heal. If you amputate the leg at the thigh, the bird can survive. But if you sever the tzomas hagidin, it dies. Go figure it. Ki solik Rabbi Abba, right? Solik, we said, means to go up, and Eretz Yisrael gavoa mikol haratzos. So Rabbi Abba went up to Eretz Yisrael. I guess he went on Aliyah. And he left behind him Rav Huna and the Talmidim of Rav Huna in Bavel. Ashkechai Reb Zera. Reb Zera had apparently made Aliyah earlier than Rabbi Abba. So when he got to Eretz Yisrael, he met Rabbi Abba. The Yosef V'Kamar Am Rav Huna Marav Shmutas Yerech Ba'of Treifa. Now that's a whole different tradition than what we found in Bavel. And therefore, Rabbi Abba, when he hears this transmission from Rabbi Zera, he gets very surprised, and he says, Amalei, he turns to Rabbi Zera and he says, Chai Demar, I swear on your life, Mi Yoma de Solik Mar Lahacha, In other words, you, Rab Zera, since you went on Aliyah, we were still back in Bavel with Rav Huna, and there were many other students of Rav Huna left back in Bavel. And we'll just read the top of Daf Nun Zayin Amid Beis. Havilan Pischon Pek Hamid Rav Huna. We had a face-to-face encounter with Rav Huna, Ushilni, and we asked him, the Amar Lunch Mutas Yerecha Ba'of Kshera. So you're quoting Rav Huna in the name of Rav that Shmutas Yerecha Of is Psula, is Treifa. We asked Rav Huna directly, face-to-face in Bavel, before we packed our bags to go to Eretz Yisrael, and he told us that Shmutas Yerecha Of is Kshera. So that's why I said before that there are various contradictions here about what Rav's opinion really is about Shmutas Yerecha Of, the dislocation of the thigh bone of a bird.